welcome to The Complete History of Science, Series 2, Episode 6, Galen and the Anatomists. In the year 162 AD, Galen set out for Rome from his home city of Pergamum in the east of the Roman Empire. At the time, this was an arduous journey, most of which was overland and would have taken several months across difficult terrain. As well as the physical effort which must have been necessary to undertake such a trip, Galen would have faced many potential challenges. Prominently, while the Roman Empire may have claimed to have made the road safe, this was far from absolute, and bandits were a constant danger. Travellers might seek refuge in inns at night, but these only appeared inconsistently along the route, and were often uncomfortable, lacking what we would consider basic necessities. On one occasion, Galen describes how he and his companions stayed with some locals who had run out of bread, and so were fed a porridge of boiled wheat. Unable to digest this, they suffered from gas for several days. On another occasion, Galen claims that an innkeeper offered him pork, which was in fact human flesh. He studied in Corinth, Crete, Cilicia, Smyrna, and Cyprus, before visiting the great medical city of Alexandria in Roman Egypt. This was an unusually long course of study for the time, and would have made Galen amongst the best educated medical men in the Roman Empire. Galen's move to Rome, however, was not unusual, in the sense that he was following in the footsteps of generations of Greek doctors who moved to Rome in the hope of making a name for themselves in the imperial capital. It's clear from his writings that Galen was personally ambitious, and his books demonstrate a singular talent for self-promotion. However, more sympathetically, Galen was also undeniably a man devoted to his craft, and his move to Rome was undoubtedly, at least in part, motivated by his desire to become the best medical practitioner he could be. When Galen arrived in Rome, despite his privileged medical training, he was initially unknown in the city. In his home city of Pergamum, he had been part of the local aristocracy, and was well known as the chief physician of the gladiator school. But this meant little in Rome, which by now had become the centre of Mediterranean culture, and a city of likely more than 1 million people. Galen, however, was fortunate to have some connections in his new home, including the philosopher Eudemus, who at one point had taught Galen philosophy. Fairly soon after Galen's arrival in the city, Eudemus fell ill, and Galen was called upon to treat him. Eudemus's primary symptom was a fever, which in the ancient world was often thought of as a disease in its own right. When Galen arrived, the fever had begun to subside, but despite the opinions of the other doctors who were gathered at Eudemus's bedside, Galen was cynical that the patient was cured. Instead, Galen diagnosed what he called quartan fever, which was very likely the disease we would know as malaria. Galen was experienced with this disease and knew that the fever would likely reoccur. It turned out he was exactly right, and Galen even managed to accurately predict that the fever would come back the next morning. This prognosis greatly impressed Eudemus's friends, including the former consul Boethus, who would later call on Galen for treatment for himself. This story recounted to us by Galen demonstrates how his talents as a doctor led him to quickly build a reputation in his new city and work his way up the social ladder. However, this was not the only means through which Galen's renown grew in Rome, and soon Galen would become famous for something quite different. Because strange though it may seem to us, Rome at this time had a culture of dissections as entertainment. These were private or semi-public events, and were popular with distinguished Romans, who came to view the dissection of animals. The surgeons carrying out these dissections would then describe the anatomy to their audience. This idea, of course, of dissections as theatre is one of those features of the classical world which make it seem so alien to us, and this is even worse than we might imagine, because the animals were often still alive during these procedures. As Galen began making connections in Rome, he started to accept invitations to take part in these demonstrations. Galen had himself long been a proponent of dissections to learn more about anatomy. He argued that knowledge of anatomy was key to developing better medical practice, and believed that all good physicians should have a working knowledge of anatomy. In his own words, the working body is not understandable without knowledge of its structure, and Galen would take every opportunity to learn more about the body. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that Galen's practice of live dissections was entirely noble, and it must have been at least in part a way for Galen to promote himself. In Pergamum, he tells us he'd actually won his position as the chief physician of the gladiator school by dissecting a monkey, and in Rome, he gladly accepted the ex-consul Boethus' invitation to perform these dissections. In the first of these presentations, at Boethus' home, many of Rome's intellectuals and philosophers gathered to watch Galen operating on a live pig. Galen demonstrated for his audience that by removing the nerve leading to the larynx, the distressed pig would suddenly stop screaming. Next, he demonstrated that by ligating the intercostal nerves of another pig, that is, tying up the nerves that control the diaphragm, the pig was unable to exhale forcefully and would again lose its voice. Galen, a skilled surgeon, could even reverse this by loosening the thread binding the nerve, so once again the pig could exhale and start screaming. Gruesome and shocking though these demonstrations seem to us, they greatly impressed his Roman audience, and as his medical fame grew in the city, so did his reputation as an anatomist. The skill Galen exhibited in these performances demonstrate his immense talent as a surgeon, but even more importantly, his diverse knowledge of the anatomy and physiology of the human body. However, it would be naive to assume that this knowledge was unique to Galen, because by the time of Galen in the 2nd century AD, a huge body of anatomical knowledge had been developing in the Greek world for centuries. As we discussed in the last episode, Galen was a proponent of Hippocratic medicine, and some of the earliest Greek ideas in anatomy appear as scattered references in these works. For example, the author of On the Sacred Disease, written around 400 BC, is aware that the brain is split in two distinct sections, although the author also seems to believe that it was the centre of the cardiovascular system. This belief was shared by the author of Polybius, the son-in-law of Hippocrates, who described the cardiovascular system as composed of 4 main blood vessels which originate in the head. However, beyond these brief mentions, the person who can truly be said to have made the study of anatomy and physiology into a systematic field was, perhaps unsurprisingly, Aristotle. Aristotle was a huge influence on future anatomists, and recognised the symmetrical architecture of the human body, distinguishing the right and left-hand side. He was also the first to formulate a standard vocabulary to describe the various parts of the body, such as the head, neck, thorax, arms, and legs. Aristotle also corrected the early Hippocratic belief that the brain was the centre of the cardiovascular system, instead recognising correctly the heart was the centre. However, somewhat inexplicably, Aristotle also believed that the heart was the seat of learning and sensation. Indeed, the heart was of central importance in Aristotle's anatomy, as he considered it the source of innate heat. This innate heat was to Aristotle the difference between living and non-living things, no doubt recognising how dead animals stopped producing heat. Indeed, this idea of innate heat was key to understanding Aristotle's physiology. So for example, in his view, the role of the respiratory system was in moderating the temperature of this innate heat, cooling the body as we breathe. By contrast, the cardiovascular system's role was in distributing the innate heat around the body. This idea was adopted by Galen from Aristotle in a largely unchanged form. The ideas of Aristotle were then taken up by other Greek thinkers. Praxagoras was a younger contemporary and follower of Aristotle's teachings on anatomy, who made his own major contribution to anatomy, in that he was the first person to distinguish between veins and arteries. He also recognised that pulsation was primarily a characteristic of the arteries rather than the veins. However, Praxagoras also made one fatal and, as it turns out, lasting mistake. Praxagoras believed that only the veins contained blood, while the arteries contained some other substance, which he called pneuma. This pneuma was an important idea in Greek anatomy and can be thought of as simply being air. However, this doesn't really capture the full meaning of the word, as the pneuma was thought of as the life-giving spirit. Praxagoras was not the originator of this idea of pneuma, which can also be found in the work of Aristotle and Hippocrates, but it would persist as a feature of anatomy throughout antiquity. Interestingly, it may be that this idea, that the arteries contain pneuma, was the result of the fact that the experiments of Praxagoras, like Aristotle before him, were performed on animals which had been strangled. Strangulation has the effect of constricting the arteries, causing the blood to leave but collecting in the veins. Hence, when Praxagoras dissected these strangled animals, the arteries appeared empty of blood. This is part of a larger point, which was that Aristotle and Praxagoras' human anatomy was highly speculative, primarily because they could only perform dissections on animals. At the time in ancient Greece, there was a great taboo against touching corpses, which made it impossible to perform dissections on humans. This taboo largely persisted through the Greco-Roman period, and so Galen, 5 centuries later, would have met the same constraint. Galen attempted to make up for this by taking every opportunity he was afforded to examine the human body. It's been suggested, for example, that Galen learnt much about anatomy from examining the wounds of the gladiators at the school in Pergamum. Galen himself also discusses how he took any opportunity which was presented to observe human corpses, such as those which might wash up after a flood. Once, during his travels, Galen came upon a bandit who had been killed by one of his intended victims. Not wanting to bury the man, the locals had allowed his body to rot and be pecked clean by scavengers. Galen, in his writings, is clearly delighted with this turn of events and took the opportunity to examine the man's skeleton. Of course, such occurrences must have been few and far between, and these opportunities couldn't have been the basis for a very systematic study of human anatomy. However, Galen did in fact have one advantage which helped him develop his own rather sophisticated theories in human anatomy and physiology. Because while Galen couldn't perform human dissections himself, for a brief period, in the Greek city of Alexandria, there were people who could. Alexandria was the city founded on the north coast of Egypt by Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC. Despite its location, Alexandria became a part of the Greek-speaking world and quickly grew into an intellectual centre, thanks to 2 institutions, the Great Library and the Museum. We've already touched upon the Great Library, which at a later date would be led by the polymath Eratosthenes and would become the receptacle for many of the great Greek scientific works. The Hippocratic Corpus, for example, would first be collected and catalogued here, as well as the works of Ptolemy, Euclid, Archimedes, and the Greek philosophers. However, it's not the library where anatomy would develop, but instead a lesser-known institution called the Museum. The Museum was created by the first ruler of Alexandria, Ptolemy I, who was, by the way, as far as we know, no relation of Claudius Ptolemy. The museum was created as a community of scholars and intellectuals, near the royal palace. It housed a wide variety of individuals, from poets to philosophers to mathematicians and geographers, who were all provided with food and lodgings. It seems to have been a lively intellectual centre, at least in the early centuries, and provided a place for the exchange of ideas between men working in entirely different fields. However, most importantly in our story, the museum also provided the environment where investigations into human corpses could take place for the first time. The reasons that this great taboo were finally broken are uncertain, but there are at least a couple of likely explanations. Firstly, Alexandria was a new city, organised under a strong central leadership, which encouraged and nurtured the intellectual interests of its learned citizens. The museum was a relatively safe and free environment, where the best minds of the time could pursue their own intellectual ends. Secondly, the location of Alexandria in ancient Egypt was important, as Egypt had its own long history and culture, separate from the Greek world. The local Egyptians had no taboo against touching corpses, as demonstrated by the practice of mummification, and the Greeks migrating to the city can't have helped but be influenced by this. The first person to take advantage of this new freedom was Herophilus, who worked around the 4th century BC. Originally born along the Turkish coast, in the Greek town of Chalcedon, Herophilus made his way to Alexandria by way of the medical school of Praxagoras on the island of Kos. Herophilus must have learned from Praxagoras the value of dissection as a means to learn about the body, but unlike the older Greek, Herophilus had the privilege of being able to perform systematic dissections of human bodies. Among his discoveries, Herophilus was the first person to describe the nervous system in detail, describing the connection between the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. This discovery led him to refute Aristotle's claim that the heart was the seat of intelligence, rightly recognizing it's the brain. He further differentiated what we would know as the sensory and motor nerves, and recognized their cooperation with muscles in allowing motion. Herophilus was much admired by Galen, and it seems that it's through him that Galen learned about the workings of the nervous system, which he put into practice in his live dissections. Interestingly, despite the fact that he undoubtedly conducted dissections on humans, it's clear that Herophilus also still practiced dissections on animals, and used this as a basis for conclusions about human anatomy. For example, his description of a womb is undoubtedly that of an animal. He also includes a description of a rete mirabile, which is a dense network of blood vessels found in some mammals, birds and fish, but not as it would transpire in humans. These mistakes were repeated by Galen, who took Herophilus at his word. Nevertheless, other aspects of Herophilus's work were more accurate, and he built upon the work of his teacher Praxagoras by investigating the distinction between veins and arteries. He recognized from his dissections that arteries have a much greater thickness than veins, and the care he took in his dissections is evident, as he notes that there's an exception to this in the lungs, where the opposite is true. Herophilus also broke from Praxagoras' teachings and identified that arteries also contain blood, or at the very least, some mixture of blood and pneuma. This correction, however, serves as an illustration of how the path of scientific discovery rarely runs smoothly, and just because someone has a good idea, or even the right idea, it doesn't mean it'll be immediately accepted. Herophilus' successor was his younger contemporary, Erasistratus. Erasistratus was an immensely skilled anatomist who performed dissections which demonstrated the smallest subdivisions of the veins and arteries. However, rather than build on Herophilus' view that the arteries did indeed contain blood, Erasistratus maintained the by now traditional view that they only contained pneuma. This was in some ways a strange conclusion for Erasistratus to have reached, because his own observations seemed to contradict this idea. While examining the small subdivisions of veins and arteries, Erasistratus was the first person to observe that the veins and arteries were actually joined at tiny intersections. Despite this observation, as well as the prior work of Herophilus, Erasistratus maintained that the arteries didn't contain blood under normal operation. Instead, he concluded that while blood could pass occasionally through the connections between the veins and arteries, this only happens during fevers and inflammation, and would actually cause overheating in the patient. He argued that during normal healthy functioning, the apertures between the veins and arteries were so small that no blood could possibly pass between them. This conclusion is made even stranger when we consider the obvious objection, which is that if you cut an artery, it bleeds. Erasistratus, of course, knew this, and so came up with his own solution. He contended that when an artery was damaged, the pneuma, which was after all an air-like substance, escaped, and blood from the veins was pushed through to fill the vacuum left by the pneuma. This turned out to be another persistent idea, and several centuries later in Galen's time, he tells us that there were many Erastratian physicians in Rome teaching this. Galen, however, took a very dim view of much of Erasistratus' teachings, and argued against the idea that the arteries contained no blood. So when one day an Erasistratian doctor proclaimed publicly that arteries contained no blood, Galen challenged him to demonstrate this by dissecting a live sheep. Galen knew that the man, like many of these doctors, had very little practical experience of dissecting animals, and was instead relying on the word of Erasistratus. In fact, Galen tells us that the man was such a poor surgeon, he couldn't even manage to expose the aorta without killing the animal. Galen, by contrast, was finally able to demonstrate conclusively that the arteries really do contain blood. He did this by ligating the aorta of a sheep in two places, effectively tying off the artery and isolating it. Then, by cutting into it, he demonstrated that the aorta, like all arteries, was in fact full of blood. Despite these public arguments with the Erastratians, Galen was in fact more in debt to the work of Erasistratus than he liked to admit, and he served as the primary source of much of Galen's own human anatomy. For example, Galen's model of the cardiovascular system was more of an evolution of the work of his predecessor than a completely new system. Erasistratus believed that the cardiovascular system began with the work of the liver, which changed food coming into the stomach into blood. This blood was then taken by the vena cava to the heart and distributed around the body through the veins. Blood for Erasistratus was nourishment, and the purpose of the cardiovascular system was in part to distribute this throughout the body. During his human dissections, Erasistratus had found that the heart contained valves, which led him to a remarkably familiar account of the functioning of the heart. He suggested that the heart was acting like a pump, and the valves were there to ensure the proper flow of blood. However, as Erasistratus believed that the arteries contained no blood but pneuma, he suggested that there was also a completely separate system, whereby this pneuma was also being delivered around the body. He theorized that both sides of the heart are performing this pumping, with one half pumping the blood through the veins, and the other half pneuma through the arteries. Essentially, Galen's view of the cardiovascular system was an evolution of this. Galen also believed that blood was created in the liver from digested food. This blood was then transported to the heart and distributed by the vena cava throughout the rest of the body. However, whereas Erasistratus believed that the arteries carried pneuma, Galen had demonstrated that they instead carried blood. Unfortunately, this left Galen with a huge problem, which was that he couldn't explain how the blood entered the arteries. Like Erasistratus, he knew that the veins and arteries were connected, but again, failed to come to the obvious conclusion that they were passing blood between them. For example, he knew that some blood was passed to the lungs, but didn't believe it was returned to the heart. Instead, Galen suggested that blood delivered to the heart by the veins passes through tiny pores in the septum between the heart's two chambers. These pores were too small to see, but supposedly passed this large quantity of blood from the right chamber to the left, which was then able to pass into the arteries. This was again a very strange conclusion to have made, given that even Galen realised there was no direct evidence of this. Galen claimed the pores between the heart's chambers were too small to be observed, but offered no other evidence for their existence. A similar issue with Galen's version of the cardiovascular system is what happened to the blood. For Galen, blood was a source of nourishment, but was also continuously being used by the body. This poses the question: what happens to the mass of blood which is absorbed by the body's tissues? That is, where does all of the used up blood actually go? Galen could only answer that it was lost or consumed. Given the different intellectual framework in which Galen was operating in, it's probably not surprising that he wasn't able to give a full account of the operation of the cardiovascular system. Galen followed Aristotle in believing that the heart was the source of the body's innate heat, which needed to be then distributed around the body. Galen, like Aristotle, took the innate heat to be of central importance, and all of his anatomy was in service to this idea. For example, Galen expanded on the idea that respiration's role was in moderating this innate heat. He believed that air, taken into the outer lung, formed pneuma, which was then transferred by the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart, and from there, cooled the innate heat of the heart. Galen's ideas, while wrong, did give a full and at least internally consistent account of the many observations which the ancient Greeks made about the human body. His longevity, then, partly lies in the fact that his work managed to pull together the many strands of ancient Greek medicine, anatomy, and physiology into a relatively neat and coherent package. In many ways, his achievement mirrors that of his idol Aristotle, who had done something similar in natural philosophy, as well as Ptolemy, who had done the same thing in astronomy and optics. When Galen died in around 200 AD, his vast body of writing would be taken as fact by his successors. Although his work would be revised and commented upon over the succeeding centuries, it would not really be surpassed until the 16th century. And so, in many ways, the death of Galen marks the decline of science in the classical world. From between the 4th century BC and the 2nd century AD, science in the ancient world had been on a path of steady progress. But, from the 3rd century AD onwards, there was undoubtedly a precipitous decline in scientific achievement, which would persist until the rise of the Islamic empires. However, we'll leave that story for another day. In the meantime, if you've been enjoying the show, I'd hugely appreciate it if you could leave a review or rating on your favourite podcast app, or even just send me an email to let me know. So, until next time, goodbye.